Ukraine is cutting Crimea off from Russia, and Putin risks losing his most important symbol. In fact, Kyiv is making it increasingly difficult for the Russians to supply the peninsula, which is turning from a strength into a weakness. And to make things worse for the Kremlin, Crimea is supposed to be the symbol of Putin's regime and Russia's greatness, not the Achilles heel in the conflict against Ukraine. I've noticed that many of you watch my videos, and I'm really happy about it, but you're not subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, please subscribe. It's free for you, but it's really vital for the project. Thank you very much. Crimea represents proof of Putin's power and the fact that Russia can annex other people's territories to return to being an imperial power. In fact, in 2014, the annexation of the peninsula became central to the Kremlin's narrative, and thanks to this, Putin's approval rating rose from 65 in January 2014 to 86 in June 2014. This makes Crimea one of the pillars on which Putin has built his own image. At the same time, however, Crimea is also a platform. A military platform that allows Russia to project power in the Black Sea and to support operations towards southern Ukraine. Additionally, the peninsula lets Russia use territory for launching missiles, drones, and naval operations. And in fact, in 2022, Russia used Crimea itself as a starting point to conquer the south of Ukraine. And one of the Russian objectives was precisely to create a land corridor connecting Russia and Crimea. This is something Moscow managed to do right at the beginning of the conflict, mainly thanks to the element of surprise. The problem for Putin, however, is the element of surprise. Crimea requires daily supplies of men, equipment, and provisions. Regardless of its fortifications, it will always depend on a few roads, bridges, and railways. So, control of Crimea also depends heavily on Russia's ability to bring in vehicles, fuel, and everything else needed by the army and more. But what are these connections between Russia and occupied Crimea? The first is the Crimean Bridge, which is the direct link between Russia and Crimea. We're discussing a 19-kilometer bridge, the only direct link between the Russian transport network and the peninsula. Moreover, for Putin, that bridge has always had enormous symbolic value because it's a monument to his annexation, and in fact, Ukraine has struck this bridge on several occasions. And for example, in 2025, the Ukrainians declared that they used over 1,000 kilograms of explosives to damage it. And the interesting thing is that this and the other attacks that have occurred actually make this bridge unsafe for moving Russian military vehicles. The second connection is the land route through occupied southern Ukraine near the Sea of Azov. This corridor connects southern Russia to Crimea through occupied areas such as Donetsk, Mariupol, and Zaporizhzhia. For Moscow, this corridor has grown more important over time because the Crimean Bridge is too exposed and serves as a bottleneck. Russia is heavily investing in the occupied territories along the corridor with over 2,500 kilometers of railways, highways, and roads reportedly built or repaired between 2022 and 2025. And keep in mind that within this effort, there's also the new Russia Highway, which is a major road connecting Russia to Crimea, passing through cities like Mariupol. And this road is part of a 1,400-kilometer-long network designed to connect Rostov-on-Don, Mariupol, and other occupied cities in southern Ukraine and Crimea. So what is Ukraine doing? Precisely because Russia has invested heavily in building roads and railways in the occupied territories, Kyiv has started attacking them with drones to disrupt supplies to Crimea. And these attacks have already caused fuel shortages on the occupied peninsula, in fact. Just think that already at the beginning of June 2026, most gas stations in Sevastopol were out of fuel. And in some areas, limits of 20 liters per person have even been introduced. And the governor of Sevastopol wrote that tanker trucks were unable to reach the city because of Ukrainian attacks on the logistical routes. So be careful. The Ukrainian campaign is not focused only on Crimea in the strict sense because it targets everything that connects it to Russia through the occupied south of Ukraine. Ukrainian forces have also struck the occupied port of Mariupol as part of attacks on Russian logistics in the area. And according to Ukrainian forces quoted by Reuters, the attack targeted energy and maintenance infrastructure, significantly limiting the operational capacity of the port. Of course, this is an assessment made by Ukrainian sources, but the picture remains consistent because Mariupol is an important hub of the southern land corridor. And the same goes for the Konar Bridge, which connects Crimea to the occupied Kherson region. In fact, Ukraine hit it twice in the same week, and the Russians were forced to suspend traffic. And in general, Ukrainian attacks have also damaged several other alternative bridges that connect the occupied Kherson region to Crimea, including some crossings over the North Crimean Canal. All this makes the sense of the Ukrainian strategy clear. Kyiv doesn't need to invade Crimea to achieve strategic results and potentially liberate it because it's enough to make it impossible for Russia to supply it and therefore to defend it in the long run. And most likely, this will force Putin to come to the negotiating table before being forced to abandon the peninsula. But how does Ukraine achieve all these results? The answer is drones, because drones allow Ukraine to strike far beyond the front line and therefore make the entire occupied territory behind the combat zones much less secure. According to a Ukrainian assessment, the goal is precisely to cut Crimea off from Russia more and more. And Kyiv intends to achieve this goal by targeting the roads and railways that connect the occupied territories to the peninsula, which are essential for Moscow to transport supplies. And again, according to Ukrainian sources, traffic on the Norwegia highway has already dropped by more than 2/3. And consider that, according to data released by the Ukrainian Drone Command, in the first 5 months of 2026, Ukrainian drone forces have reportedly neutralized almost 51,000 Russian soldiers and struck over 176,000 enemy targets. However, we have to say that Reuters specified it was not able to independently verify these figures. Anyway, still according to Ukrainian data, drone units make up only 2.5% of the Ukrainian armed forces, but they have still caused about a third of the total Russian losses in the last 12 months. The number of medium-range missions reportedly rose 28-fold, while deep strikes in Russian territory increased nearly 4 times. However, these figures should be viewed with caution. However, they help a lot to understand how Ukraine compensates for having fewer troops by being able to strike deep and make resupplying more difficult. And in this context, I also want to mention the Morrigan drone, which is the new Ukrainian drone designed to hit medium-range targets behind the front line. So especially trucks, convoys, roads, and railways used by the Russians to supply Crimea. We're talking about a drone that is relatively inexpensive, easy to launch, and is already making things much more difficult for the Russians. But then, what will happen to occupied Crimea? Gradually cutting Crimea off from Russia doesn't automatically mean liberating it, but it does mean creating the conditions that make holding onto it difficult and increasingly costly for Moscow. And today, thanks to advances in drone technology, Ukraine can really make Crimea more and more isolated over time. But be careful, the next step, actually driving the occupiers out of the peninsula, will be very difficult and would even require a very complex and dangerous ground advance to carry out. But this doesn't mean that Russia can keep Crimea without problems forever. Because if the conflict continues like this, and if the costs keep rising, Moscow might even end up being forced to abandon it on its own. Crimea, even without a major Ukrainian ground operation, simply because holding on to it would become too burdensome from a military, economic, and logistical point of view. However, before reaching such a point, I believe that Russia will try to sit at the negotiating table to save Crimea and save face, because negotiating would be much less humiliating than withdrawing after being slowly worn down. And what is Russia doing to defend Crimea? Moscow is reportedly trying to respond in various ways. On one hand, it was strengthening the infrastructure, and it has already allocated about $11.8 billion in federal funds for the development of the 4 occupied territories between 2024 and 2026. An amount almost 3 times higher than the total sum allocated to about 20 other federal regions involved in national priority projects. So we're not talking about small numbers. In concrete terms, this means new roads, repaired railways, and also alternative routes. These are designed to make supplies to Crimea safer, as mentioned at the beginning of the video. In fact, on the other hand, Russia is also trying to distribute supplies along multiple routes, precisely because the Crimean bridge is too exposed after the attacks it has suffered in recent years and is now considered a sensitive passage for military transports and sensitive cargo. And obviously, the alternative routes are also needed in the land corridor, because if the Ukrainians make some routes in the corridor unusable, the Russians need to have other roads to take, so the more routes there are, the better. And in theory, the more secure Crimea becomes in terms of supplies. In addition, Moscow is also trying to better protect the logistical routes and to repair the damaged points more quickly. But the problem is that defending such a large area every day from drones that are increasingly numerous, efficient, and low cost is very difficult, and the situation risks getting worse. Do you think Russia can keep Crimea? Share your thoughts in the comments, like and subscribe if you enjoy my videos. Bye!